You said 3 days, one narrow pass, and a decision so ruthless that it still asks you a question today. If escape was possible, would you stay anyway? In 480 BC, the Persian Empire came for Greece with a force so large that even ancient writers struggle to describe it without sounding unbelievable. Some sources claim hundreds of thousands of troops and more, while modern historians argue for lower totals, yet still agree the invasion was enormous by any realistic standard. Against that tide stood a Greek coalition numbering only a few thousand at the start, anchored by a Spartan king named Leonidas and his hand-picked guard of 300 hoplites. They did not march north expecting to win in the simple sense. They marched to hold a line long enough for the rest of Greece to prepare, to unify, and to survive. This is the story of Thermopylae, and if you listen carefully, you'll see it isn't a myth about muscle and glory. It's a real lesson in terrain, psychology, political pressure, and the price of buying time with human lives. To understand why Thermopylae mattered, we have to step back a decade. In 490 BC, Persia had already tested Greece and been shocked. At Marathon, Athenian-led Greeks defeated a Persian force that expected a quick punishment raid and an easy victory. Persia withdrew, and in the ancient world that kind of humiliation didn't fade. It fermented. When Xerxes inherited the throne, he inherited the wound, and he turned it into a mission. Xerxes wasn't just a king with an army. He was a ruler of an empire stretching across vast lands, peoples, and resources, a system capable of gathering ships, engineers, supply lines, and troops from many regions. Ancient tradition credits him with grand engineering feats like bridging the Hellespont with boats chained together, and whether every dramatic detail is literal or embellished, the strategic reality remains. Persia prepared on a massive scale, and Greece was a target. Now, picture Greece at that moment. Not one country, but a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, often rivals, suddenly facing a force big enough to erase their independence entirely. Some Greeks argued to submit, some argued to resist, and some delayed because disunity is what small states do until the threat becomes impossible to ignore. Sparta, however, was built differently. Sparta was not just a city. It was a system designed around war. Spartan boys were trained from childhood to endure hardship, to obey, to fight in formation, and, most importantly, to hold their nerve when terror tried to loosen the line. By adulthood, the Spartan hoplite was not a seasonal soldier. He was professional, built for disciplined violence in tight ranks, shield locked to shield, spear working like a piston. At the center of this system stood King Leonidas. Ancient sources surround him with legend, but the core is believable. He was a leader shaped by Spartan law, Spartan expectations, and Spartan duty. Over his decisions hung a prophecy recorded in Greek tradition, delivered by the oracle at Delphi. Either Sparta would lose a king or Sparta would fall. In the modern mind, prophecy sounds like poetry, but in the ancient mind it sounded like weather, something you didn't argue with, something you prepared for. Leonidas, by many accounts, believed the meaning was clear enough to act on. If a king had to die, it might be him. Yet here's the twist that most people miss. Leonidas did not march north with Sparta's entire army. Some of that was likely due to religious festivals and laws that restricted full mobilization at that moment, but some of it was also strategic. A delaying action does not require every soldier in the state. It requires the right place to fight and the right men to hold it. Leonidas selected 300 Spartans, an elite guard, and ancient sources add a chilling detail that tells you he was not choosing for easy victory. He chose men who already had living sons. If they died, their family lines would not die with them. That selection doesn't romanticize death. It acknowledges it. It says, quietly and brutally, we may not return. But Leonidas was not marching alone. Thermopylae was not only 300 versus Persia, even if that phrase is easy to remember. A Greek coalition gathered, men from Tegea, Corinth, Phocis, Thespi, and other cities, along with Spartans and their attendants. Depending on the source, the defenders at the start numbered around 7,000. The Spartans were the elite core, but the stand belonged to many Greeks, and one group in particular, Thespians, would later choose a fate as total as the Spartans and be too often forgotten. Leonidas and the coalition marched to a place that looked like a crack in the world. Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, named for its sulfur springs. In antiquity, the pass narrowed between mountain and see so tightly that only a limited front could fight at a time. This was the point. Persia's advantage was numbers, cavalry, and the ability to overwhelm an open terrain. Thermopylae was not open terrain. It was a funnel. It was a stone corridor that turned an empire into a line. At the same time, the Greek navy contested Persian movement along the nearby coast around Artemisium. Thermopylae was part of a larger delaying plan, not a single isolated gesture. When Xerxes arrived, the scale of the invasion stunned even those who prepared for it. Even if we reject the most inflated ancient counts, the Persians brought a huge army and a fleet that supported it, along with logistics, engineers, and the confidence of an empire that had absorbed countless peoples before. Xerxes expected the Greeks to take one look and do what smaller powers usually do: surrender. Instead, the defenders stayed. For days, there was a tense pause. Xerxes waited, perhaps thinking fear would work for him without spending lives. The Greeks used the time like professionals, testing ground, organizing rotation, checking armor, rehearsing signals, positioning men where the pass forced the enemy into maximum compression. Ancient stories describe Persian scouts seeing Spartans exercising, oiling their bodies, and combing their long hair. To Persians, it looked like vanity or madness. To Spartans, it was ritual, a calm preparation for battle and death, a way of saying, "Our minds are settled." A Greek advisor in the Persian camp, often identified as Leonidas, warned Xerxes that Spartans do not behave like ordinary men when cornered. They fight hardest when escape disappears. Then came a demand that turned into a line that outlived empires. Xerxes sent a message: "Lay down your arms." Leonidas replied with 2 words preserved by tradition: "Molenlebe, come and take them." The war of nerves ended, and the war of bodies began. The Persians advanced, wave after wave, and the pass did exactly what Leonidas had chosen to do. Only so many Persians could reach the Greek line at once. Their numbers behind them, instead of helping, became pressure that shoved men forward into spear points. The Greeks fought in hoplite formation. Shields overlapped, spears thrust over the wall of bronze, each man protecting the next. The Persian style of fighting, often lighter equipment, different formations, and a reliance on missiles and mobility, was strong in open ground. But at Thermopylae, the Greeks forced a blunt collision. The killing was not cinematic. It was mechanical. Thrust, withdraw, step, replace, hold. The Greeks also rotated men, keeping the front line fresh. The Persians, packed into the narrow approach, could not easily rotate with the same efficiency, and fatigue is a silent killer. As hours passed, bodies piled. Footing grew slippery. The air filled with dust, sweat, and iron-smelling blood. Xerxes watched and saw something that cut at the heart of imperial psychology. His army was not flowing through Greece. It was breaking against a wall. Some accounts say men were whipped forward. Whether literal or not, the point is plausible. Commanders in huge armies sometimes resort to force when morale falters, because fear of the enemy becomes stronger than fear of punishment. Day 1 ended with shocking losses for Persia and minimal losses for defenders, and the psychological damage was larger than the physical. Persian soldiers had been taught that the empire was unstoppable. Now they had seen it stopped by a few thousand Greeks behind bronze shields. Xerxes decided to end the stalemate with elite force. He sent in his famed immortals, an elite unit whose numbers were maintained by replacement, creating the impression of a core that could not diminish. These were supposed to be the men who broke problems. They advanced into the pass expecting tired defenders. Instead, they met discipline and ground that refused to give them the angles they needed. Greek accounts describe tactical tricks, control withdrawals and sudden reforms, that punish Persian pursuit, and whether every detail is exact or dramatized over time, the reality remains. The immortals did not simply sweep the Greeks away. They took losses, and they failed to break the line. By the end of the second day, the story was spreading to the Persian camp. If even the immortals could bleed and retreat, what did that say about the god-king aura of invincibility? Xerxes had numbers, but numbers don't matter when only a few can fight at once, and numbers matter even less when the men carrying those numbers start doubting the outcome. Yet, Thermopylae was never invulnerable. Behind the main pass, a mountain path offered a way around the defenders. The Greeks posted guards there, including Phocians familiar with the region. Leonidas understood the risk. He understood that the entire defense was a bet that the path would remain unknown or unexploited. And then one man made a choice that doomed the position. A local Greek named Ephialtes, motivated by resentment and promised reward, went to Xerxes and revealed a mountain route. This is the part that should disturb you most, because it isn't about armies. It's about how history can pivot on ordinary human weakness. A shepherd or local guide who knows a trail can matter more than 1,000 shields when the geography is the entire strategy. Under cover of night, Persian troops moved along the path. The Phocian guard were surprised, and in confusion they failed to stop the bypass. Near dawn, a runner reached Leonidas with the news. The Persians were behind them. The pass would be attacked from both sides. The choke point advantage was about to vanish. At this moment, escape was still possible. The Greeks could withdraw south and preserve the core of their forces. This is where Thermopylae becomes something more than a battlefield moment. It becomes a moral and political decision. Leonidas called the Greek allies together and dismissed most of them. The war was not over, and Greece would still need soldiers. Most allies left to fight another day. That decision matters. It proves Thermopylae was not simply a death cult performance. It was a strategic delay, and Leonidas did not demand pointless death from everyone. But Leonidas and his 300 Spartans remained, and with them remained the Thespians, about 700 men, who refused to abandon the pass. They were not forced by Spartan law. They were not Spartans. They were free men who chose consciously to stay and die. Other contingents remained as well, including Thebans in some accounts, though historians debate how willing their presence was at the end. What is not debated is that the final defense was carried by men who understood the outcome. Ancient tradition preserves a dark humor among the Spartans, the kind men use when fear must be controlled. One famous line says that when told Persian arrows would blot out the sun, a Spartan answered, "Good, then we will fight in the shade." Whether anyone said it word for word is less important than what it reveals. They were determined to master terror with contempt. As the third day began, the Persians attacked from front and rear. Leonidas did not simply crouch behind the narrowest point and wait to be crushed. Accounts suggest the Greeks advanced into more open ground at points, trying to maximize Persian casualties before the ring tightened, turning the last stand into a last offensive. Spears shattered, swords flashed, shields became bludgeons. Formation, the thing that made them nearly unbreakable, started to dissolve as bodies clogged the space and the fight became close, brutal, and personal. In the chaos, Leonidas was killed. The sources differ on exactly how, but all agree that once he fell, the struggle intensified around his body. The Greeks fought desperately to recover him, because a king's corpse is not just a body. It's a symbol. If Xerxes could take it and display it, he could claim psychological victory even over death. The Greeks pulled back to a final position, often identified as a small hill or rise, forming a last ring with the dead and wounded at the center. The Persians attacked repeatedly and still paid for every meter. Then Xerxes chose a method that large armies choose when close combat is too costly. Missiles. Arrows fell in dense volleys. The last defenders were cut down under a storm they could not block forever. In the end, nearly all who remained were killed. The 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, and others who stayed to the final moments. Persia had taken the pass. In a tactical sense, Xerxes won. But history is not only tactics, it is consequences. According to ancient accounts, Xerxes ordered Leonidas' body found and desecrated, an act that even many in the ancient world would have seen as extreme. Greek warfare had customs of honoring the dead, and violation of those customs often signals not strategy, but wounded pride. Xerxes had achieved his objective, yet he had watched his army bleed far more than expected, and he had watched a small force refuse submission in a way that shook the psychology of conquest. Persian casualties are debated. Ancient writers give dramatic numbers. Modern historians argue for lower totals. But all agree the losses were heavy relative to what a simple breakthrough should have cost. Now here's the key point that turns Thermopylae from tragic defeat into strategic turning. Those 3 days mattered. While the Persians were stalled, Greece prepared. Athens evacuated its population. Greek fleets gathered and coordinated. Arguments among city-states shifted because proof had been delivered in blood. Persia could be resisted. The stand at Thermopylae did not single-handedly save civilization, because history is never that simple, but it contributed to something very real and measurable: time, morale, unity, and the will to continue to fight even after cities burned. Xerxes marched onward and found Athens largely empty, then burned in fury. It looked like Persia's unstoppable march was back on track, but the Greeks had used a delay to set a trap at sea. At Salamis, Greek ships fought in constrained waters that reduced Persian numerical advantage, and the Persian fleet suffered a crushing defeat. With naval dominance threatened, Persia's supply and mobility became vulnerable. Xerxes withdrew with much of his force, leaving generals to continue the campaign. Then came Plataea, where Greek land forces met the Persians and won a decisive battle that shattered Persia's hopes of conquering mainland Greece. Thermopylae did not win those battles, but it helped make them possible by buying time and forging unity through sacrifice. And that is why, when people speak of Thermopylae, they don't celebrate Xerxes taking a pass. They remember the defenders who stood where they did not have to stand. Yet even that memory deserves accuracy, because the full story is more powerful than the simplified slogan. It wasn't only Spartans, and it wasn't only 300. Thousands held the pass at first. And among the most remarkable choices in the entire event, the Thespians stayed to the end by choice, accepting extinction beside men whose entire culture trained them for that kind of duty. If you want the real lesson, don't erase them. Thermopylae is also not a clean fairy tale about good versus evil. Persia was an empire, yes, but Persian soldiers were not monsters. They were human beings following orders, fighting for their king, many far from home, facing an enemy that refused to behave like enemies usually do. And Sparta itself, for all its discipline, was a harsh society built on strict control and sacrifice long before any Persian arrow flew. That complexity doesn't reduce the courage on display. It makes it more real, because the stand was not heroic because it was pretty. It was heroic because it was chosen under pressure, with fear in the throat and death in the math. So why did Leonidas stay when retreat was possible? Partly because Spartan law and expectation demanded it, partly because the prophecy weighed on him, and partly because the mission was never simply survive. The mission was to delay, to force Persia to pay, and to prove to Greece that resistance was not fantasy. By selecting men with living sons, as ancient sources report, Leonidas may have been acknowledging that the cost would be final, while ensuring Spartan families would not be erased with him. That is not romantic. It is cold and practical. It is leadership accepting consequences. And what did Xerxes miss? Xerxes understood power. He understood scale. He understood logistics. What he underestimated was the psychological effect of men who refused to be intimidated. Empires are built not only on soldiers, but on reputation. When reputation cracks, the cost of conquest rises. Thermopylae cracked something in the Persian narrative. Soldiers talked. Fear spreads faster than orders. And on the Greek side, anger and inspiration spread even faster. A memorial was later placed at the site with words that became immortal not because they are elaborate, but because they are simple and severe. Stranger, tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their laws. No boasting, no numbers, no attempt to pretend it was anything other than duty fulfilled at the highest price. That is why Thermopylae lives. Not because it was the biggest battle, and not because it ended in victory, but because it produced an example that outlasts armies, a defeat that becomes a weapon, a message that travels farther than a fleet. If you strip away movies and exaggerations, Thermopylae remains astonishing. A coalition held a choke point against overwhelming force for 3 days. A betrayal via mountain path ended the position. A king dismissed allies so they could live and fight later. A corps stayed to the end. And that sacrifice helped buy time for the battles that truly decided the war. Xerxes took the pass, but he paid in blood and morale. Leonidas lost the battlefield, but he and those who stayed gained something more durable. A story that has been repeated for 25 centuries whenever people face impossible odds and still refuse to kneel. Now ask yourself the question that Thermopylae refuses to let you avoid. If you were told the enemy was too large to stop, if you knew the path behind you might close, If you had one chance to delay the disaster so others would prepare, would you stay when you were allowed to leave? At Thermopylae, thousands stood at first. Most withdrew when the position was turned, and a final group chose death with open eyes. Their bodies fell, but their decision became a kind of signal fire across history. Courage is not measured by survival, and sometimes the most powerful victory is giving your people time to win the next battle.